Whether the question was asked by a parent, a spouse, a coworker, or a friend, anyone in the BCG community has likely fielded the question, aren't you a little old for this gaming thing? Sometime in their adult life. If you're listening to this podcast, chances are you made the decision to face this question head on, connect with your why, and continue with the hobby in spite of opposition. On today's episode, we explore the transition into gaming adulthood and the reasons why we continue in the hobby. Welcome to episode 57 of the Business Casual Gamers podcast, the show focused on gamers with jobs, with families, who have things to do in real life. I'm Aaron Connick, alongside my always co-host, Chris Smoke. Chris, how are we doing this week?
I am doing excellent. I say this every episode, but this really is one of my favorite topics.
We got a lot to get off our chest on this one,
It's good.
Chris.
It's a good one. I think we all can kind of feel the pain, the collective pain and suffering, but you get behind the topic.
We are, and we're going to take this in a couple different directions. But before we get to that, let me just tell you where to find us on the interweb. So easiest place to find us, as always, our website, businesscasualgamers.com, has links to all of the stuff that might take you to the Twitters, for example.
The Twitters.
Where you can find us at BIS Casual Gamers. You can find us on YouTube. Chris just released some content about a week or so ago.
Yeah, very short intro video.
And search for us at Business Casual Gamers and subscribe. And if you like what you hear on this episode, and frankly, any of our other back catalog of awesome content, the best thing you could do to help us, honestly, would be to take a moment and rate us, whether it's iTunes, any of your preferred podcast mediums of choice. The best thing that we can do, and that we always encourage our audience to do, is if you like something, give it to somebody else who might like it too. And that's how we build the community and build more fun topics and feedback loops to hear about what you're thinking about as business casual gamers, and give us ideas to talk amongst ourselves on the show. So with that, let's get into our BCG discussion topic of the week. So we're going to do this in a couple of different phases, I would say. So we're going to start off with, what is the stereotype around adult gamers, right? That mystical unicorn of a creature that is the adult gamer. What are all the stereotypes? We're going to kind of get some things off our chest during this first phase. Then we're going to move past the stereotype and we're going to get into the facts, right? The hard demographics of who and what age groups play games, right? Because for all the misconceptions, for all the assumptions that are out there, there is data on this and this can be resolved. Then we're going to talk a little bit about our personal journey, identifying through experiences we've had, saying, all right, I'm not a kid anymore. I'm an adult and I still play games. How do I really kind of bring that into my life? How do I mix games and life to where I don't keep these two kind of separate things? And then we're going to kind of close with, why do we continue? What is our why, Chris, behind why we continue?
Why?
We're not going to get super philosophical, but we are going to talk a little bit about what's personal to us about gaming and what has carried us through, and certainly welcoming audience feedback through any of these. So Chris, let me kick off, and we'll trade some stereotypes here. So, Chris, the one I hear the most often that, I kind of smile, grit my teeth a little bit, and hear them out before retorting. But it's like, oh, gamers and they're living in their parents' basement, unemployed, bumming their Wi-Fi connection, just endless hours, never going anywhere in life. I hear that one often, Chris, and I'm just sitting there like, I moved out of my parents' basement a long time ago. I have a room that may be bigger than your apartment that houses nothing but old games. I don't want to take your crap, son, about what I should be doing with my life.
Never mind the fact that when you're having that conversation, you're most likely in a work environment.
Yes.
You're an employee with your other co-employees, and you're like, wait a minute. No, I did move out of my parents' basement, and it was more than 18 months ago.
Right. No, that is something that absolutely drives me mad. The other one, Chris, and I know we both have a lot to say. This could be an entire show. Aaron, isn't that just kind of a waste of time? And they say this coming off of a night before where watched two different sporting events for a team they've never played for, don't know any of the players, don't live in the city, never played the sport in some cases themselves. I'm sitting there saying, okay, let's digest that for a moment. So my thing is clearly a waste of time, whereas your, leisure activity of choice of sitting on the couch and watching something, That is a fully productive, contributes
Exactly.
to society use of time. We are curing cancer here, Chris.
Well, it's funny because, I would say that at least, I actually could give some sports, sports fans are very big. I can give them their sports stuff, right? I watch sports from here and again, right? But when someone says, to your point, when someone comes in and says, yeah, man, I watched like 26 episodes of Friends last night. I've seen them 4 times. I'm like,
The binge watch.
really? Did you really? I mean, you binged until like 3 or 4 in the morning and now you're freaking tired and you have no idea what you're doing. And it's like a Friends. You've seen the show like 1,800 times. Yeah. And you consider that to be a useful use of your time. Okay.
But my 4-hour play session, total waste of time, Chris.
Juvenile, Aaron.
Just absurd.
It's juvenile.
Matt LeBlanc, though.
But he's so dreamy.
He is.
But aside from that, I watch it for Marcel the Monkey. But that said, the waste of time argument has always been funny for me because, let's face it, I don't think it is anyone's, it seems a little disingenuous, I'd think, across whether for me to say, like we just did, that watching TV is any more or less a waste of time than anything that I do. I mean, we know a lot of people who collect coins. We know people who like, I was watching the other day, this is a really random example, but people who take, pencils and they take the little point in the lead and they actually hollow out into sculptures. I mean, a lot of people would look at that and saying, oh my gosh, you're wasting your life. But it's really cool. And the people who do that are really awesome. And so I think that, what I'd like to convey here is less of what it is you choose to spend your time in is a waste of time. It's really more in the line of you chose to spend your time that way. So it really shouldn't be an issue. And
I think this is something where I feel like the gaming community is very open and accepting of other people in terms of saying, look, hey, if you want long walks on the beach, you want to play with your dog, you want to travel, whatever.
Dig holes.
Dig holes. You want to be a ditch digger, there's probably a game where you can do that virtually.
Yes, of course.
Right?
Hey, shh. VR opportunity.
Okay.
We can make that.
But I look at those and I say, I don't have a problem. I don't feel the need to attack somebody else's leisure time just because that's whether it relaxes them, whether it keeps their mind focused on something, whether it's kind of escapism for them. Whatever it is, they don't need to justify the existence to me of why they do that. But I feel that for years and years, I'm somewhat put on the defensive where somebody gives you that look of, okay, well, now you got to sell me on a reason why I'm not going to judge you. And I'm saying, when did this become this double standard where I get to justify my existence and you just get a pass on anything you do is for the greater good?
Right.
And that's where I think I have the sticking point.
Yeah, and it's really what ties to me. And it depends on the personality, right? I know a lot of people who, their leisure time is they could be sitting down, literally staring at a wall. And the fact that they're doing nothing is amazing to them, right? They love it. People like me, for example, like I have a very busy mind, right? And so I always want to be doing something. Like if I were doing math problems, as horrible and weird as that sounds, that would be more fun to me than staring at a wall. And so, to each their own when it comes to what they really enjoy. And again, to your point, Aaron, I mean, I really think that's the thing here. It should be a no judgment zone. And I know it's easy to say that, but we always have these scenarios where, life is giving us a lot of newer ways to really kind of spend our time. And I think a couple hundred years ago, whatever, well, maybe maybe it's been around shorter than that, but skydiving, right? Jumping out of a perfectly good airplane, right? How many people at one point was like, well, that's a waste of your time. And not to mention you could easily die, but we have people who get so much thrill and so much excitement out of jumping out of airplanes, right? This is something that we should, I hate to say foster, I guess, but it sounds kind of awful having friends jump out of planes.
And that's totally
true.
You
do you.
So you touched earlier about kind of the collection. So I want to transition a little bit into that because both of us, obviously, you can look in the background. I've talked about my collection extensively. You tell people, hey, I collect old video games or whether it's whatever your collection consists of. And people look at you and say, man, that's not a very adult collection. Shouldn't you be collecting exotic bottles of wine from this certain vintage? Or shouldn't you be collecting your 18th Rolex watch or something like that you can't wear on your 18th wrist that you don't have? I mean, there's stuff like that where when I look at it from a collection standpoint, and we've touched on this in past episodes, so I won't try to justify the act of collecting necessarily. But I can actually, even though there are not enough hours in a lifetime to sit back to back and play all of my games, I mean, the reality is I like the appreciation of just like a fine bottle of wine or a watch, of saying there's a story behind this game. And even if I'm not about to pick up and play my next 60-hour playthrough, I have memories of that are triggered by just looking at the case on my shelf when I look at it. And even if I don't play it, I have that momentary kind of rush of appreciation for the series, the time I've had with it, in the same way that somebody who has watches that they've collected or cars that they've collected that have a story in their life of, hey, I went to that car show and I saw this, and that's why this thing's in my garage, right? You don't need to take a road trip across the U.S. to appreciate that car. It's that temporary emotion that it gives you that, again, for a very modest price relative to other hobbies, to me, it gives you that same rush of emotion if you're really connected to the video gaming hobby.
Well, why do we have art? Why do we, put paintings on our walls? Why do we do all these kinds of things as far as like decoration and all that? And I was watching an architecture video a little while back, and there was a gentleman who was walking through his house, and he was pointing out all these random things like bowls and things. And to your point, Aaron, what he was talking about was not the fact that he has a black bowl on his table, but the fact that that black bowl was acquired in Tokyo, and it reminds him of the trip he and his wife took to Tokyo and how great it was. Or here's a sculpture that I have, and I keep this sculpture here because every time I walk through my entryway, I see it, and it reminds me of X, Y, Z. So you really when you think about, especially in the nostalgia era, a lot of us collect. I'd say more than not, a lot of BCG type people want to collect some form of games, and by collect I don't mean go out and buy every NES game ever made, but they say, hey, I love this game called Blaster Master, when I was playing Nintendo, and I just want to go pick that up because I just I'm connected with that from an emotional state. Also, if you had friends or whatever that you haven't haven't talked to in a while, whatnot, maybe you have their favorite game or something to help bring that connection back. It's all that kind of psychological connection that kind of helps keep you excited about what it is that you do. And for people like us who have largely grown up, over the years playing games as a big, strong pastime, that's going to be something that continues to be, a go-to source for us.
Yeah. Another one that's fresh on my mind, because I had this conversation this week, is you get the person that is our age or older, let's say. They say, yeah, I used to like to play games, but man, when they added those crazy fourth buttons, I mean, who can keep
X
up?
And Y, man, it's horrible.
There's 2 joysticks now? This is crazy talk. And sitting there saying, okay, so you're a master's educated individual that has figured out things that are far more complex. You go to work every day and work on a keyboard that has way more keys and things that it could do than a gaming controller. Yet you're telling me you can't look up in a video game. Where you're losing me.
Well, it's funny. I actually have a similar story where I was talking to a retired Air Force colonel who spent a vast majority of his career in the Air Force flying like the craziest, most dangerous jets in the world, right? And you show him something like a controller or a remote control or anything like that, and he looks at it and he's like, I can't do this. And the point is, I want to scream. I'm like, oh my gosh, you can fly the most complex. You can do like all these crazy controls in the cockpit of a fighter jet, right? You can do it at like 6 Gs, and you're cool, you're fine, but you can't
can't play Ace Combat though.
Can't hit X and
accelerate
at the
the
same
jet
time,
in a
right?
video game.
And I think really, I think that's this goes back to it's not that they're physically or mentally unable to do it, but there is a little bit of a we all experience these kinds of blocks mentally. Where not from I don't mean like we have these kinds of things in our head that just help us feel like there are boundaries, right? And not to get too philosophical, but I was thinking about this the other day. When you think about people that build these cartridges, for example, right? The actual cases and the cartridge. Well, you think, well, who makes NES cartridges? Well, Nintendo. They make those cartridges. You never stop to think, oh well, I could actually go figure out the dimensions of these things. I could go press like a die or something for this thing, and I could go pay someone to manufacture these controller or these cases for me. And then what you get is games like these retro re-releases where you've got a game that was made last year put into an NES cartridge. And It sounds stupid, but many of us would probably look at this and say, well, I can't make an NES cartridge. Well, actually, maybe you can.
Right.
And it's breaking down some of those barriers that we just kind of mentally set ourselves up for. And when you think about, in this case, you've got a person that is highly qualified at some very, very technical tasks, and then they look at these gaming controllers and they think, well, I can't do that. Put them in front of the game, let them play it for 2 or 3 days over the course of, a week or whatever, and then come back and see how well they're doing.
Yeah, and another one that I want to touch on that is very personal to both of us. Obviously, we've described kind of our careers throughout the course of the podcast, and I've always heard something at times, sometimes in casual conversation, usually innocent enough, but joking but not joking, let's say, where people are saying, oh, shouldn't you focus on your career? You're spending all this time. People, again, the gamer in the basement stereotype of you're spending all this time. You could be forging ahead in your career. And a lot of times, especially having come from an environment in my prior job where expectation was people were working a lot of hours.
Mm-hmm.
There was kind of this expected cadence to your week and your year that you were going to be spending most of your life with work as the number one priority. And I look at that and I say, okay, so let's kind of break this down. Maybe fair comment that if I were truly, truly devoted, I could spend more time. Maybe I'm going to put down my RPG and do 10 more hours of work instead. But what a lot of people who were making that comment don't want to focus in on is the fact that they have their own coping mechanisms to get through the week. Oh, I'm going to go binge drink on the weekends and, not be able to wake up until 2:00 in the afternoon, or I'm going to go travel out of the country so that my BlackBerry doesn't get service at the time. These type of things where people, they've got their own methods of coping with the week or escaping or decompressing, whatever you want to call it. But somehow that is a more noble adult form of coping than sitting down and playing a video game that, like you said, we can all debate the tangible, intangible benefits of gaming. But in my mind, I come away from that oftentimes refreshed, more creative, certainly not destroying my body by binge drinking or things like that, where I'm saying, what's the worst option here?
So what you're saying, Aaron, is that we need to refocus the show. We're going to make a pivot in the BCG show here, and it's going to be about accounting and cybersecurity.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
We don't need to be fooling with this game stuff here.
I thought that was actually going to be like snorting some nose candy off the edge of an SNES cartridge to get through the
not to do that, but to each their own, I guess.
Okay, I thought that's where you were taking this, but okay.
I was going to.
Your idea was
more of the boring, nerdy kind of. No.
Scratch that. No, that is not what we do to get through the BCG episodes.
Let's talk about taxes.
Yeah, no, that's not white powder on my nose. No, I don't know what you're talking about.
Oh my God. This has gone off the rails.
Off the rails. So let's talk about who are the gamers of 2018, right? When we were growing up, Chris, there was a very, I think valid in many cases, stereotype. When you go back to the NES era, the NES was marketed to children in the United States.
Yeah,
definitely.
Oh yeah, most definitely.
And there was no bones about it. Nintendo, that was their target demographic. But certainly once Sony got into the mix, Sony was clearly going after a different demographic. And ever since they got into the game, and even Nintendo's come along for the ride in certain cases, the demographic has tended to skew older and older. As the NES gamers of yesteryear, you and I, have now grown up into adults and still want to continue with the hobby. And so now I'm going to read some statistics and we'll kind of talk about it. So if I were to break out the pie of gamers by age, you've got 28% of the population that's under 18, 29% in the 18 to 35 category, 20% in the 36 to 49 category, and 23% are 50 or older.
That's a really interesting. I mean, name another. I'm going to eat my words here. Name another industry vertical where you've got that kind of a 20-20-20 split across
That's crazy.
all the age groups.
It is. It's literally crazy. Universal. I couldn't, short of going 25-20. I mean, this is very evenly split, and I don't understand at this point when you have. Okay, it'd be one thing if you were to say, okay, it's either under 18 or 18 to 35. Okay, then we can debate maybe it skews younger. Where are the older gamers? But when you have fully 43% of the overall gaming population in the 36 and older category, we can't really call this a children's hobby anymore. I think that is intellectually dishonest. I think the only real difference here is that kids, the 18 and under group, they are not afraid to talk about their gaming hobbies in a peer group, right? If you were to go to an elementary school anywhere in America and say, hey, I play Fortnite, you have instant friends. You do. You have people that will want to talk to you.
All of them. Yeah.
Right? You're going to have that instant bond where it is a very unifying, positive thing. Whereas if you were to go into a workplace, even though the demographics are on your side, people have the stigmas that we talked about earlier where they fear that if I say I'm a gamer in a workplace, I am going to have nobody and everybody's going to laugh at me and judge me and think, even though the demographics would say you're just as likely to have people saying, oh my gosh, you play too? What do you like? What kind of games do you like?
Do you know actually whether this is global or within the U.S. or this?
I believe this is a U.S. statistic.
And see, that's the interesting piece because one of the things we will gloss over in this conversation, but should not be overlooked in the larger conversation is the fact that a lot of these stigmas that we're talking about is very U.S. focused, right? And I don't know, to be honest, would love to hear from you as listeners. How does it work as far as these kinds of stigmas in your neck of the woods, right? If you are in South America, you're in Africa, you're in Asia or Europe, how does this work? Obviously we've talked in the past about Japan. In Japan, there's no stigma, right? There's no, we talked about that one time when I was in an airport and I was playing, the one where I had to blow into the
DS, yeah.
So we had these kind of scenarios where you've got this waifu stuff that pops up that I'm already kind of can't believe, embarrassed. It's like, that I have to do this kind of stuff. But, the act of playing a Vita or playing a 3DS or something on a train or mass transit or on an airplane, even today, for me, even with the Switch, is a little bit odd in America, where you go over to Japan and you see it everywhere. People pull out their gaming consoles or their portable stuff all the time. And, it's interesting to see how that is different across the world. These numbers in 2018 in the US is really exciting because I think we're finally starting to get there. And I think, Aaron, you hit on something else that we didn't talk about yet, which is we talked about how the gaming companies are starting to come around. That's really interesting because, to your point, when the NES came over and the Super Nintendo, admittedly, they wanted to kind of move away from the traditional video game sense because the crash of Atari was so bad. We're going to make these look like VHS players, right? Tape players. But it was still very much marketed at kids. Genesis came out, right, with Tom Kalinske and head of Sega. Sega of America, they were really going towards the teenage, a little bit more, still under 18, but still a minor kind of a category. And Nintendo had always shied away from it. One of the things that is really interesting, and this is an interesting anecdote for me, is there's a company called Limited Run Games, which is affiliated with another gaming company, put out great stuff. But Limited Run will go out and find a whole bunch of old games that they kind of like a GOG, right? They go out and find games that are really interesting, that are no longer, they were like for the Sega CD or they're for the NES or whatever. Maybe not NES, but those kinds of older games. And they will, PS2 games, and they will retarget them effectively for modern consoles. So what you can get is, and as an example, we just got last year Night Trap for PS4 and other related consoles. And what they do is they buy out, they work with a license. They say, we're gonna produce 2,000 of these things, or whatever the number is. And that's it. That's the only number they produce. That once they're done, they're done. And what was so interesting to me is not only I missed out, unfortunately, on the Night Trap for PS4 last year, and I was really frustrated about it because not that I really enjoy Night Trap. I think it's more or less a terrible game, but I do think that it's an interesting, it's an interesting part.
It's a piece of history.
It's a piece of history. It's really interesting in the Sega CD form, certainly. But I did get this, I pre-ordered Night Trap for the Switch.
Oh, that's cool.
And that's interesting because to your point about Nintendo has been so focused on making sure that they're putting their seal of quality on things and ensuring that the games that they provide are for everyone, kind of like E for Everyone is an ESRB rating. Right. And people have been criticizing them for many years that they are prevented from playing games on their consoles that are they're a little bit more interesting or more provocative in some way, shape, or form, whether it's violence or whatnot, because Nintendo didn't do it. And what happened, I think, in the N64 era and maybe through GameCube is Nintendo was for the kids. Like even I would think,
absolutely,
oh, well, N64 and all that stuff is really more of a kids console. I want to be, I'm in my 20s, late teens. I want to be a little more edgy. I'm going to go for Twisted Metal on PlayStation or whatever it might be. But now we've also started, I think for this to actually happen culturally, the game companies had to have come around, which they did, saying, hey, I'm Nintendo. I'm going to put the games in front of you that you as the older gamers who have grown up with our platforms now want. And also I'm going to provide the same kinds of things for the newer gamers coming through that. And as a result, you get a little bit more of a strategy or like a shift in this culture that we're kind of talking about here.
And one of the things you touched on that I think is relevant, even if you didn't know these statistics, let's just say I wipe these statistics and we're to say, based on what games are selling and the nature, the content, the subject matter of those games, who do you think the audience is? Who do you think the broader market is? If these are the AAA games that get all the marketing budget, that get the holiday bundles, all this stuff, who do you think is playing games? And I don't think somebody could look at the Call of Duties, the Uncharted's, God of Wars, things like that to say these are the marquee games of our time and say, oh, it must be a little kids thing. Like these don't make sense for little kids. It does. I'm not saying that little kids don't. You and I have both played M-rated games before we were allowed to, but you can't assume that is going to be the only market for this. You would never justify a game existing if you did not have a fairly robust adult player base that you knew was going to support that in a meaningful way. And so when I just kind of logically look at this, even people who don't play games, I think you could generally go into a kind of the party conversation with a person you didn't know, and a person could name some big games, right? Their kids play, their neighbor, whatever. They know games. And you just kind of logically conclude, okay, well, then don't you think there are some grownups that are likely in this very room with us right now that are actually playing those games? Because why would they be produced otherwise? Yet people, I think, still, they held on to this Nintendo mindset for years.
Another aspect of this that I think is certainly related to this conversation point is, well, two things. Number one, we talked about this in an earlier episode about, what makes a gamer a gamer. We talked a lot about, and if you haven't heard the episode, please go back and look at it. We talked a lot about what's a real gamer versus what's a fake gamer,
right,
and whether there is a distinguishing factor or set of factors between them. And we talked a little bit more about mobile, right? So people who play Candy Crush, are they gamers? If you play Candy Crush 10 hours a day, are you a hardcore gamer? Still a question, right? But so there are some of these things that have popped up. The ubiquity of these devices, mobile gaming in general, has helped that. The other thing, let's stick on that mobile gaming for just a minute, because I think that we talked about, irrespective of the people, getting that the ubiquity up, like getting to the point where everyone has the opportunity to play a game at any point in their career or in their lives, and the fact that these devices are stuck to almost everyone all the time means that you have an opportunity to game at any point. Back in the 90s, right, you couldn't play at work, you could only play when you're home, and you can only play when the TV wasn't being used. So if you're a kid, right, and your parents want to come home and watch their shows or want to watch the news or whatever, you have to wait for them to be done with that before you pick it up. And that was one of the things that was challenging from a perspective of getting people in. The other point that I'll make, and this is something that might be a little controversial, but you talked about Call of Duty, right? There has, back in the early, I'd say late 90s, probably more the early to mid 2000s, we had this big thing we've talked about before with FPSs, and it's the big COD Rage, it's all of the Medal of Honor, all those kinds of games that are out there that are more FPS related, that brought in what I'd call bro gamers.
Right.
And I don't mean that in a negative sense, but I mean there's just a very specific kind of gamer who wants to come in and frag some people in FPSs and don't even care about those RPGs things, don't care about any of these other games. I just want to get in a competitive game and go mess stuff up. That's totally fine. Totally fine. But, there are a lot of those kinds of people that come in. Now, you could argue how much of the, I'd love to see a breakdown of among all these, these age groups, how much of the 50-year-olders are more mobile focused versus more console focused.
Right.
Or how many of these gamers across the board are more focused on FPSs in general. Because while they are gamers, I think a lot of us who are more generalist gamers, I'd say, we'll pick up anything that looks fun, whether it's a puzzle or a sports game or an RPG or whatnot. When you have these kinds of verticals within the industry itself, so these people who only play FPSs and nothing else, no other games are fun, you kind of start asking yourself, what is the gamer? And, it's funny because, ironically, when we have this conversation about these subcultures of gamers, the only FPS players, I think that's what actually started to bring, from my perspective, a lot of the day-to-day, stigma breakdowns to it. Because RPGs, people can look at and say, hey, they're kind of nerdy, right? But fragging someone, with an AK-47 or whatever,
cool.
That's pretty cool. We've always liked war movies. We always like war recounting things. And now we're getting the same level, ironically, of violence that we talk about when we see in all these movies and things. We can now be the person behind that gun. We can go find that person. We can own them. All this stuff has really helped. I hear it talked about more. So when I hear games spoken about in more public settings, it's okay to say, yeah, I got a 20-to-1 kill death ratio in COD last night. Cool, dude. That's awesome. If I were to come in and say, instead of that, I'd say, hey man, I got my character in Final Fantasy level 13. I learned Cure 2. And people were like,
huh? You're right.
What nerd?
Actually, we should try that. Chris.
Lightning bolt. I mean, really, it's
Demi?
It's
no?
Yeah, right. I mean, so
don't want to brag about Demi. Okay.
I think it does come back to subcultures or sub verticals inside of these games, which is like the genres we're talking about. Any sort of war related stuff or whatever, violence related stuff, sadly, perhaps, might be more interesting. It might be better at breaking down those barriers, whereas some of the more nerdy RPG tabletop, numbers, dragons, elves, and spells might continue to be a little bit more stigmatized.
I think that's a great point. So Chris, let's talk about some of our own experiences, getting past the stigma, getting past the fear, and just owning basically our gaming habit as an adult. So there were kind of really 2 points in my life that I really think about as the point of no return, where you're saying either I'm going to self-identify and say I'm a gamer and this is a big deal to me, or I'm going to cower away or make the decision, oh, I shouldn't do this. I'm going to be somebody that I'm not. So the first time was really when I met my wife. So when I met Roxy, we were both in college, and I can't remember exactly how the conversation came up, but as most conversations like this tend to go, usually it's like, oh yeah, I had an NES and I had a Game Boy and I played, XYZ
cool
games. It was cool. Like I haven't played anything since then, but yeah, I remember liking those. And you kind of have that, like, I love Chip and Dale Rescue Rangers. I love you have this point of commonality when you're saying, yeah, I've played all those, but I'm actually planning to play this game tomorrow, and I've just finished this game last month. So this is not something that I left back in elementary school. This is ongoing. And I remember, my wife was very accepting. It was a hobby that we no longer really shared together. We didn't play games together as we were dating. I remember when we got married and we finally moved in together, there was this kind of point of conversation where Roxy said, I never really had an expectation or a hope that you were going to quit gaming. She said, it was fine with me. I didn't matter at all. I was fine. But she goes, I always did kind of wonder, are you going to hit this point where you just don't care about games anymore? And I think it was probably like about a year into our marriage where she just said, I kind of at that point, I realized, no, this is kind of here to stay, and this is something that's important to you. And again, it didn't come from a place of it mattering in the sense that she was trying
Everyone has a flaw.
Right. It wasn't she was trying to fix me, but it was something that I remember just as a point of no return, in essence. I could have tried to, when that initial conversation came up, oh, yeah, that was back when I was a kid. I don't do that anymore. And you tried to act cool about it or whatever you want to describe that as. But I'm proud of myself for owning who I was and saying, you know what, this is still an important hobby to me, and this is something that I want to continue with and I find value in. And I'll tell you why. And even if I'm not going to create a new business casual gamer, we can appreciate each other's perspective, and she can appreciate what the hobby means to me. And I think that's been something that, even though we've almost never played games together throughout our 13 years of marriage at this point, the reality is, now that we have kids and I can play games with our kids, and she doesn't want to spend any time doing that, and they're more than happy to spend all the hours of any waking day doing that, I think that's something that she's grown to appreciate.
Yeah. Well, we had, it's interesting because I had a very similar kind of conversation with my wife. It's funny because we were dating in college, and it's funny because, when you live separately, right? We lived in 2 different apartment complexes on the same campus. And so I would go hang out with her. We'd watch movies, we cook dinner, we do all these kinds of things together that normal people do, in relationships. And then, at night comes and we'd have to go like midnight, 1 o'clock, whatever. I'd go back to my apartment because we'd have tests or get up early or whatever we had to do. And what I didn't mention, I guess, I didn't think about it, was, I'd go home and I'd play games because I lived in an apartment with 6 other guys, and they all played games, and they played it. They were much more hardcore than me. So I'd come home and they'd be like, dude, we got to get going. Let's do this. And we'd start playing, right? And, that was it was hilarious because when we got married, I never thought that I was, I never mentioned in gaming really, because I knew my wife wasn't, or my future wife was not necessarily interested in that. And her friends weren't necessarily interested in that. So we went and did our own thing with her, and then went and played games. And when we finally got to the point where we got married, she laughs at me now because she's like, I didn't know what I was getting into, because I didn't realize that you have, all these systems show up when we start living together, and you realize that this is something that's an ongoing kind of a thing. But I think it goes back to, she had very much the same kind of perspective. This is a big part of Chris's life. This is a big part of what he does. And she understands from my perspective, like I mentioned, it's very hard for me to sit and watch something and not do anything else. I like watching movies, but I like watching some TV shows, but I can only do it in small pieces. What I can always do is play a game. And the reason is because I'm usually more engaged. Like, my brain is engaged in making decisions. My hands are engaged in moving the character and whatnot. And I'm always trying to think, being a programmer in my background, I spend a lot of time thinking about how they're made, how they're working in the background. It's never just what is on the screen. And games, I find, are much more engaging in that respect. They're much more, you can build your own kind of a perspective and build your own narrative and story and all of that. It's hard to do that in TV or with a movie. You can kind of think about, I bet this character is going to be the bad guy at some point. Or if you really want to get nerdy, and yes, I do this sometimes, I can think about how they lit the scene, or I can think about how the production team put together the view, the angle, or the whatever I'm watching. But that kind of detracts from movie perspective. And I just don't feel as engaged in that, right? Like, movies and those things are meant to be statically, sitting there watching. And for me, it just doesn't do as much. And so, it's funny. My wife has picked up on that and saying, he has to be engaged. His mind has to constantly be going. And this gives him a good outlet for that. Yeah. A little bit more interaction, where she's the kind of person where she's had a rough day at work, or, she's worked for 8-9 hours a day. Kids are all bed, whatever it might be. You've done all the things for the family. And when we settle down, she just wants to sit down and just rest. I still keep going.
Right. And I think that's an important, just point of contrast, and it's okay to be different in that regard.
It is, yeah.
Now, another thing that I think we both had experience with, it was honestly a more, I think, difficult point of reckoning for me, was when I was going to start talking about this with coworkers. Because, right, when the inevitable question, the small talk question of, what'd you do this weekend, comes up, right, that's a choice.
Played 16 hours of Final Fantasy.
Yeah, and honestly, so when I started my first job, Final Fantasy 12 had just come out, and that was the right answer. That was, maybe it was like 14. I don't know what it was.
I went to the bathroom twice.
But right, I was trying to, level up and set my macros correctly to be able to, to get one of the summons. And I just remember, I can't remember exactly what year, but at first, honestly, I was very tight-lipped about it. I didn't.
Oh, yeah.
you're
we all
worried
know the
about what
feeling.
people are going to say. You certainly have people that you're working for. Some of them were closer in age, but some of them were of a generation that predated video games. And I could just kind of naturally assume, unless you pick the hobby up later in life as an adult, this probably wasn't something you grew up with that you're going to understand in the same way that I understand. And so there was a point, and I can't remember exactly what triggered it, but I started talking about games. I think I'd pick something up at GameStop after work and start talking to people. And honestly, most of the people that I talked about it with, they didn't play themselves, but they didn't have a problem with it. They weren't particularly interested in it, but they could tell I was interested in it. And so they kind of humored me to carry on the conversation and ask some questions. But I'll tell you, through that process, I discovered enough other people who, the minute I started talking about it, or you kind of give the context clues, right? You say, oh, I was playing this, or I have at the time, I've got a PS3. And I remember one of the guys who worked for me at the time talking about how his Xbox 360 just red ringed. And so, right, it starts a whole conversation. And even though many of the people that I met in my first job were what you would call kind of the bro gamers, right? They were people who were playing Madden or Call of Duty on the weekends, which again is totally fine and still a point of commonality. It's funny that when I made the transition to my next job, which is right around the time that we started the show, Business Casual Gamers, I remember the exact conference where I mentioned to my coworkers, who at the time I was relatively new to the company, kind of knew them, but not really. And I said, I'm actually doing a podcast about games. And I just remember like the pause at the table of, wait a minute, you have a podcast? Wait, you listen to a podcast? No. I actually do. I am part of the podcast. And there was this, phones start coming out, and you inevitably have this, well, here we go. I guess there's no turning back now. And but it was something that was such a cool turning point, because in that moment, I met so many people who also played games. I remember having a conversation about one of the particular games with a coworker in my cubicle, and one of our interns at the cubicle next to me says, did you just say Final Fantasy VI? And wanders over and strikes up a conversation, strikes up a bond right there that I'm saying, if I never would have said anything, none of this ever would have happened. It never would have created this community. It never would have created this kind of safety net to have people wander into my office now and just say, hey, what'd you play this weekend? Right. And that's been such a cool experience for me that, looking back on it, sure, there are people that hear that and they give you the eye and they're saying, what is this guy? Do I need to assign him more work? Like, what's going on here? But at the end of the day, I think for the people who appreciate it, the reward that I get from having those conversations and people knowing, hey, there are other people that are just like me that do this, that are public about this, it makes a much greater impact, positive impact on me than any of the having to deal with that momentary disdain that you're getting from some people that, again, all the stereotypes we talked about, some people are just never going to get it, and that's fine. I'm not seeking their approval, and I'm old enough now to be kind of comfortable in my own skin to the point where I'm saying, look, if you don't like me because I play games, whatever, I can deal with it.
It's okay. You're fired.
Yeah.
No, I
really?
Yes. It's funny because I think we all go through this, right? Whether in any social situations, you assess people and try to decide if they like the things that you like. And gaming has always been a hard one for me. So I also like cars. Cars is a little bit more of an easier, easily acceptable kind of a thing, where if you strike out with the people, they're like, oh, cool. He likes cars. A lot of people like cars. No problem. Yeah, I'm not a fan of cars.
I own a car, though.
But that's cool. I can see how you like, Ferraris or Porsches or whatever. That's always been an easier thing for me. So I start there sometimes. But, there are a lot of times where it's interesting, because this is one of the reasons why we started Business Casual Gamers in the beginning, is because we know that there are a lot of people out there that do this. And the more you talk about it, the more it comes up. So my last job I did, it was a little bit more of it was a professional environment, obviously, but there were a little bit more of I guess the age range a little bit towards the younger side in the group that we were working in. And, I had a Hylian shield. I had a couple little things like a Mario mushroom and Hylian shield, and little small things that I put on my desk. And those were intended to try to get people to say, oh, Zelda, or cool, Mario, and talk about it a little bit more. But the other thing that I had done as I got a little bit more bold, was, a lot of people didn't know about speedrunning back then. This was many, many years ago. I actually, when SGDQ or AGDQ would come up, I would go into we had a lab area where we had a lot of interns and other people working, a common working area. I would turn on the TV, I'd turn the stream on for those games. And I think it's interesting because a lot of people got more interested into speedrunning there, but it also really started to shift the culture of our team into really understanding like how much of the gamers we were.
Yeah.
Like it got these, these college age interns who are really scary. They're scared in some cases to come out and talk to, the big boss or anyone else about games. It got them to talk more about games. It got me to talk more about games. And I'll tell you, initially, especially when I was to the point where I was managing, 30, 40, 50 people, it was hard because you don't want, I felt weird, even in my own skin, saying, I have a video game podcast. I have, all these games. I collect all these games. People know about all this stuff, right? We turn on these speedrunning shows, but I also have all this professional relationship with all these great team members, and they're all, working with me and for me in some cases. And it just seems weird. Like I'm a boss, but I'm also kind of, it's almost like I'm delegitimizing myself because I'm also a gamer. But what we ended up doing, we doubled down on it really. And I think through kind of doing it in two different ways, from a ground up and from a top down kind of perspective, we got to the point where gaming culture was such a big part of the team. Even for people who weren't gamers, weren't video gamers, they would still identify with the stuff that we did, and whether they were doing like card games like Magic or something like that, or they even did board games or anything else.
Right.
They started to really, it became more about video, or less about video games, and more about gaming in general as a passion. And we really, I think the team was a lot more cohesive for that kind of an effort. I don't see those kinds of things very often. And I'm not trying to paint myself out as being some sort of hero here, but it was because we found ways to strategically, hey, you gamer, strategically open up those conversation pathways.
Planting those, what I call those keywords that really trigger something in somebody's brain to say, oh, it's okay to talk about games with this person. And sometimes that's all it takes is practice and learning how to get good at that. But I agree. I mean, the benefit or the positive upside that comes out of this is exactly what you described. And I hope that is encouragement to some of our audience who may feel like they're in situations where they're at that point where they're saying, I don't know if I really want to talk about this with other people. Hopefully that gives you some encouragement.
You know what? There's another thing that I want to mention that was interesting. I think I mentioned it a long time ago on a podcast. You might notice if you watch the YouTube channel, or if you see me, I wear a lot of t-shirts, and they're almost all my t-shirts are video game related. This is an SGDQ shirt. And so what I've started doing, and I won't lie, it took me a little bit of time to think about this. When I go to the grocery store, when I go out, if it's more of a casual scenario, I'll just put on a game t-shirt and I'll go down to the grocery store. And part of me felt a little bit weird again about it, because again, the stigma is kind of attack. Oh, he has a gaming shirt. Like, really? You're that into gaming that you're that immature that you're gonna wear a t-shirt like out? Wear something out. Like, wear something normal. But it was funny because I would go out and I'd go to these stores, and admittedly, like, somebody in the store would either stop me, or I had a guy, an employee of one of the grocery stores here locally, when I was walking out, looks at my shirt. It was a speedrunning shirt, again for AGDQ, and it had some Final Fantasy characters on it. And he's like, Final Fantasy. And that immediately got a conversation going. And, I do that just as a way to hopefully get more of those kinds of things where people are like, I know that. That's a video game character. I remember playing video games, and start the conversation. And for me, it's exciting. It's kind of like leaving the Himalayan shield on my desk at work, or the Mario mushroom. It starts some of those conversations. It really gets people going. It gets, it gets those friendship built up, because like we said in the GameStop episode, the problem with our area, with us in general, is that we're kind of like hidden somewhere. Like, there are more gamers than we ever thought that are next door to you, that are right down the road or whatnot. But because we don't wear, like you might wear a Pittsburgh Steelers hat or an Atlanta Braves hat or whatever, because we don't wear a Nintendo hat everywhere we go, we can't easily be identified. And that's the thing, I think, that when you have these kinds of, where we had laid out the roadmap for GameStop, which they still haven't called me yet. I don't know why.
Oh, you haven't gotten your consulting check?
I have not. Ooh, you know what? Oh, you did? Oh, man.
Well, I needed to take my job to supplement my income now that I've been fired.
Of course, you need to got to put food on the table. But I think those kinds of things are areas where we can kind of build up the overall communication among gamers and try to identify all those BCGers out there that we know are kind of running around. So I think that's an interesting point. And it's funny that we, even in 2018, even with these stats that we're talking about, even with all the, people like us who are probably more overt about gaming than anyone else because we do have podcasts and people can go on YouTube and can see our faces and can hear our voices. There's no hiding from the fact that we are dedicated gamers. And, I'm trying to do my part. I think everyone else is trying to do their parts and trying to, get this, the kind of dull roar, get that amplified a little bit more so that we can start to identify that, hey, there's a lot of people out there that love what we do.
And let's talk a little bit about, exactly. So let's talk a little bit about what is it for us that's kept us in the hobby? What pushed us past that barrier, going from childhood where everything, it's cool to be a gamer, to adulthood where you're putting yourself out there a little bit. So one of the things you touched on earlier, kind of the contrast of what do you want to do in your leisure time? What decompresses you? What takes your mind to a different place to help you relax and help grow you as an individual? One of the things that I hear from a lot of people is how they enjoy watching movies or watching TV shows or reading fiction books because it kind of transports their mind to this different kind of place that they could never go in ordinary life. And I completely relate to that 100%. I said, completely understand what you mean. And I think when people have the view of video games as Call of Duty or Madden or whatnot, when they're looking at the hobby through that lens, it's very difficult to say, no, I scratch that same itch for this kind of fictional world, these characters. I scratch that in a similar way, but I do it through a video game that I can play and interact with rather than kind of a static television show or book or whatnot. And again, I don't necessarily begrudge people if you want to pick up a book and that is more meaningful of using your imagination and having to imagine the picture rather than see it projected on a screen. That's fine. I don't have a problem with that. But I think that there is a fairly large population of people that don't really look at video games as a valid form of fiction, where I look at it and say, it's the best form of fiction. It's so versatile. In my mind. It's so versatile. I mean, even within the same piece of content, not unlike a more complex choose your own adventure. I mean, you can have multiple experiences and stories unfold within the same game in different playthroughs. And I feel like I'm actually, instead of being stuck with the story that the author wanted to tell, there are always constraints in a game. I'm not going to go too far off the beaten path. But the reality is I can create an experience that if you play a game and I play the same game, we can meet up and talk about it. And we may have had two completely different experiences that reflect who we are as people, as gamers, that if we were to say, hey, what about that latest episode of Friends or a TV show? We saw the same thing, right? You may have picked up on jokes that were funnier to you than they were to me. But the reality is we saw the same thing. We had the same experience. And there's very little standard deviation from the mean, where I think games are like the richest form of fiction that are out there in the world today.
Well, I think it goes back to the versatility, too. I mean, obviously, the storytelling, to your point, the rich storytelling you can get from a fiction perspective is... You can't even describe how amazing those can make you feel. I've spoken many times about some games like What Remains of Edith Finch. Unlike any other game, TV show, movie, anything I've ever experienced, that game hit me harder than anything I've ever played or ever experienced. And I can't tell you why it did that to me, but it was a video game. I think they have that opportunity. But the other thing that I'll mention from the versatility perspective is if I want to have competition outside of gaming, maybe I'll go get 10 people, 10 friends, and we'll go play football. We're going to play some tennis. We're going to go do something like that. If I want to have fiction, go pick up a book, right? Or maybe I'll watch a movie. If I want to do, if I want to do these kinds of things, there are discrete activities that you have to go pick up. And usually they are across different genres or different areas. It's real. I mean, if you want to have competition, I guess you can have a board game in some cases too.
Sure.
But if you wanted to go get that kind of thrill of real like twitchy kind of competition, you typically have to go outside and go do a sport. I'm not saying that's bad, but in video games, what's interesting is if you want to have that twitchy competition, you can when you want to play a sport, you can go play Madden. Or if you want to do twitchy competition and you don't want to do sporty stuff, you want to go like do kind of hunting kind of stuff or whatever, you can go do a PUBG or you can go do some sort of an FPS. If you want to have a really interesting story where you pick up characters in a fantasy world or a sci-fi world and you grow them through their life, help them make their decisions and kind of see the outcomes, you can do that, right? Or if you want to do something completely different, if you want to have this story of a character called Edith Finch and you want to slowly, like a book, only more deeply undo the layers of the onion of her family and see all the positives and the negatives and experience, those kinds of things in a very vivid way, you can go play a game. And I would argue that while you can poke holes in that conversation piece and say that there are certain analogs to gaming that are non-physical or non-sport like or whatnot, I still think that the versatility of games is you can pick an emotion and you can really drive at that emotion in a very deep way with a game, with an interactive game. Not saying you can't do it with movies. You can do it with movies. You can do it with TV shows. You can do it with books and things like that. But I argue that the more engagement, because there's more engagement there because you as a person, as a player, are really helping to drive the narrative, deciding what to go look at and when, deciding what decision, making the decisions for what you do, whether you jump off that cliff or whether you go down the stairs to get down to the beach, whatever it might be, right? Those kinds of things help make this much more of a compelling, compelling kind of venue to experience these kinds of things.
I think, too, gaming is very personal in the sense that when we gave the analogy earlier of, let's say you're going to binge watch a season of a show, right? The only thing that you have committed to that act is I sat down, I paid my money, my subscription money, I pressed play, and I devoted 12 hours of my time, right? Whether there is no skill requirement, there is no thought requirement. If you pay the entry fee and commit the time, you're in, and you have had the same experience that anybody else could have. Whereas if I give just a recent example, and there's been countless throughout my lifetime and yours, if I look at this past weekend where I beat Golf Story for the Nintendo Switch, I will tell you when I got to that last hole and I said, okay, got to sink this to win. And I made that final putt and I knew that I had the high score and I finally beat the game. That triggered the same sense of accomplishment in my brain as anything I've ever done at work, any speech I've ever given. Even though I can objectively step back and today sit here and say, okay, I know that what I accomplished in Golf Story is not like winning the Masters or something like that. Okay, I get that. But at the end of the day, anything that we accomplish is really just kind of a culmination of chemicals in our brain that give us a certain emotion.
Right.
Whether that's triggered by playing a Switch game on your couch or actually training to become a Masters champion, right there, that same release of chemicals that say, hey, this is awesome. I feel so accomplished. That is real. And I tell people, I've never gotten that same feeling from a passive form of media because I didn't do anything to earn it. Even with simple games where the intent is they're going to handhold you to the point where there is no way if you commit the time you're going to lose. Even that process where you're following prompts and arrows throughout the entire game, there is still a feeling of an individual journey that you had to go on. And I had to put skin in the game and press buttons and think and solve puzzles or do whatever the game requires of me. And that by the time I have completed whatever the game is set, whatever the parameters of that game are, I really feel a personal sense of accomplishment that I've just never felt with watching the Super Bowl or watching a show or going to a concert, things like that, right? Where that are normal forms of leisure for other people.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting to think about that as how engaged you are versus, in playing golf versus doing other things. from my perspective, you're right. I think that the personal experience with these things are really compelling for me. That's one of the reasons why I play these games. The next aspect, the other aspect I think that's interesting is they can kind of be an ancillary helper for other types of skills that we have, right? Things that things that we used to be good at. Like, say, I used to be really good at baseball, and now I can say I can't play baseball nearly as well as I used to be able to, largely because I am older and things like that. And so if I want to play baseball, I can find a way to continue to get those endorphins you're talking about, right? Still, can you get that kind of reaction by playing a video game? And it's almost analogous to the same thing. Like you said, you might not feel as physically tired as going out and playing baseball, but if you go play a game and you end up, crushing that fastball that comes at you, you hit that home run, like that 400, 500 foot home run we used to hit in triple play, 98, whatever it was, maybe it's 750 feet. It was crazy. But those kinds of things are all really important factors for how gamers can connect us to, the past, our childhood, and things like that. I like doing that today. And that's really one of the reasons why I still play, and not even connect us to childhood, but also connect us to other areas. To your point about football, right? You can watch your favorite team win the Super Bowl, and you can be happy for them, right? But you're right. I personally don't feel, unless you're a really big fan, you don't feel a lot of that connection. However, if you go play Madden and you take your team all the way through the season and you win the Super Bowl.
Oh, yeah.
You do feel
that was you.
And I think this is why, as an ancillary point, I think this is really why MMOs, one of the reasons why MMOs became such a big deal, because you've got this micro life in a sense, right? For many of us, you're going to have many, many, many years of life as you go from childhood to adulthood. And in an MMO, you can do that in this period of hours, days, over months, as opposed to over years. And granted, there's another piece to it, which is like you can make yourself super powerful and you can do things you couldn't do in real life. But I think one of the reasons why people really enjoyed MMOs is because you can build and define this character from scratch and help them grow, in an own unique way. And they can be, in many senses, a vessel for your accomplishments. And that can be good for anyone, whether you have no disabilities or disabilities in some cases, right? You've got people who have trouble, with mobility and who can go out and can run a marathon in an MMO, in a sense, or can go do all these things they never could do before. And I think those kinds of things are really the personal connection there and how they relate to real life, your childhood, and all of that as a kind of a big ecosystem is really why this has become gaming has become such a compelling pastime overall.
Yeah, and let's talk about the childhood aspect, because I was listening to somebody recently and they made a great point that stuck with me, where they said nostalgia is one of the most underrated things out there, and that we discount that away and say, oh, that doesn't mean that much. We've talked about it many times on past episodes, but as hard as it is to believe, we're talking about NES and things like that, even though that feels like a long time ago, in the grand scheme of many of the hobbies we've been talking about, right? People following NFL teams have been doing so for decades and decades and decades. Mm-hmm. Soccer, similar things, right? We do not have a long lifespan when it comes to the gaming hobby. There are people alive that didn't grow up with games. Mm-hmm. We're approaching the point, won't be within the next year, 10 years even, but we will reach the point sometime in the future where pretty much everybody that's alive will have grown up in a world with video games, mm-hmm. where that has just been a thing, and whether they liked games or not, that's just part of the world that they live in, and nobody will have lived in any other world. And when I look at that and I say that at that point, even if not everybody loves games, a significant portion of the population will have that point in their life where they did play games, or they mm-hmm. had that one game or that one experience going to a friend's house playing a game. And I think that if realistically everybody in their adulthood spends some amount of time trying to relive childhood memories, right? Childhood is so much, for so many people, a time where you were carefree, you focused on just doing the things you love. And people try to recapture that spirit when they're adults and they have jobs and bills to pay and responsibilities and things like that. And when they talk about relaxation and what would rejuvenate me, all they want to do is be like a kid and do something that they actually did as a kid. And I know for you and I, that's certainly something that I think about a lot when we play old games or when I buy an SNES Classic, and I'm thinking, wow, I just want those memories of when I could sit down. I can't sit down every day of the week. There's no summer vacation where I can sit down and jam out 16 hours of Secret of Mana. But I can remember what that was like just by looking at the game or thinking about it or playing a couple hours of it. And I think people severely underrate sometimes how much gaming nostalgia that there is, not through just playing through a game for the 20th time, but just kind of surrounding yourself with the culture or conversations or podcasts like this one, frankly, that just trigger those good nostalgic feelings.
Yeah, I think nostalgia is such an interesting component to all of this. And you're right, people don't really think about a lot about it. But it's really why we do a lot of this stuff, right? It's why I have all these things in the behind us, and if you're watching the video on YouTube, it's why we have all these collections. It's frankly why we still go back to the Final Fantasies and try and hope that they're good when they're actually not. I think those are the things that we're always trying to recreate, the things that were so vividly interesting in our lives, and again, to get the endorphins, kind of get that excitement from doing this stuff. And it's really why we go after these kinds of pastimes in general, whether it's like driving fast in a car or winning a sports game or whatever, all very similar things. And I think we always spend time. People often say when you get to the point where you have kids in life, if you have kids, you live vicariously through them. Gaming is a way to kind of still connect with those childhood things, because not often, oftentimes, especially in the U.S., from a cultural perspective, we're grown up to say, okay, we're going from being a kid, you're happy go lucky, you're excited and all this stuff, and then okay, now you're an adult. Now you need to be stern. Now you need to worry about taxes. You need to worry about getting money. You need to worry about retirement. You need to worry about all these things that are real life things. People keep saying on social media, oh, now I'm an adult, or, I'm still trying to be an adult, trying to figure out what it means. That's really what they're trying to get at, I think, is that in this culture, there is supposedly a time when you cease being a child and begin being an adult, as though it's some sort of black and white flipping a switch.
Yeah.
Really, what we're trying to do, and what everyone does, whether they admit it or not, is try to stay connected to stay connected to childhood, whether they're living their lives through a kid, or they're trying to read fantasy novels or whatever it might be. Gaming, again, back to the original point, because I'm getting a little philosophical here, is an area where the versatility, again, is just so great that you can scratch all those itches, and you can do it on your terms, in your ways, when you want to do them, whether it's on a train with a 3DS, it's in your office or your game room at night, or it's in a room with a whole bunch of your best friends. All those kinds of things can be done with it. And I really think that's the overall value of what it means to be a gamer. And I think, Aaron, you made an absolutely excellent point about having people in the world right now who have not grown up with games because of it's such a multi-billion-dollar industry, because of the ubiquity of gaming in general, especially, and I will, we kind of looked a little bit down on mobile gaming in our episode when we talked about it, but especially because mobile gaming, I think that we're going to have that time when everyone's been in a world with gaming, everyone's been exposed to gaming, and whether you enjoy it or not, you're going to appreciate it. Much like I can say, hey, you like tennis. I don't really like tennis, but that's awesome. I know why you like tennis. Instead of, oh, you like tennis? Are you 10? It's the stigma will go away. I hope it will go away in the U.S. I'm sure it will. I hate to say I think other areas in the world will probably be a little bit more advanced than us in this regard, largely because you think places like Japan have done this already, and we have a little bit more time to go through. We have a little bit more of a stigma because Americans unfortunately, people like to look at Americans and say they're lazy, but in the end, really look at it, we tend to work a lot more. We not trying to compare necessarily, but we tend to work very hard, and we don't take, long lunch breaks usually. And when it comes down to being serious, Americans have been very focused on the capitalistic, be very serious, make a lot of money kind of a perspective. And we also oftentimes forget about taking the time to enjoy ourselves and enjoy life, which I think maybe other societies are better at than us.
That's a great point. And the last point that we can close on, I won't go too far in depth on it because we did an entire episode on how does gaming help us in real life. But I firmly believe, now we were joking before we started recording, right? The classic gaming justification is, it improves hand-eye coordination, right? My hand-eye coordination is 10 out of 10, power level 9,000 because I've played games my whole life. Now, okay, there may be some truth to that. I don't require a whole lot of hand-eye coordination in my day-to-day job, but what it does give me the opportunity to practice is a lot of things that I do use every day. So strategic thinking, making quick decisions or assessing what's going on and figuring out how to react quickly, being able to just think creatively and having an outlet outside of work to go to a different place, to see, to imagine how things could be, and to just kind of get out of my own headspace of what do I see every day and how do I be creative and imaginative because I'm exposed to this different world that doesn't exist in reality. Being able to, honestly, I think I mentioned this on that episode, but I taught my little brother how to read through video games. I mean, there's so many just tangible skills that whether you believe it or not, vocabulary.
I taught myself Japanese because of Final Fantasy V.
Exactly. Norse mythology through God of War. I got a refresher on that recently. There's so many interesting things that come out of games. And I really feel like people who are still stuck in this mindset that it's all just aimless leisure with no actual tangible benefit to society or to the individual. I really challenge that and would tell people maybe not every game. Maybe there are proof points that you could look at and say, no, that just doesn't help at all. That's actively hurting you. And maybe there are limits to it lets you appreciate great, weird Japanese music. Come on, Chris. That is a tangible skill if I've ever heard one.
It's a rough one. It's a stretch.
But I think that these games, they do such a great job if played in moderation and in a way that you're looking for them to supplement or provide you additional skills or perspectives or experiences that you wouldn't get in everyday life. I have personally found that to be a huge benefit to me. And no matter what challenges I might get to that, I will still hold up video games. It's one of the things, if people were to ask me the question, what have been major influences in your life that get you where you are? I think having that common point, whether it's just been meeting friends. I mean, Chris and I became friends through video games, whether it's social interactions, whether it's tangible skills, whether it's just kind of keeping me in a good state of mental well-being to say, hey, I'm happy because I got to play games this week. Maybe I had a rough week at the office, but you know what? I got to play this game and I had a good time. So when I look at the total of the week, I'm going to focus on the fun day of gaming that I had and not the tough day at work I had. That's a great place to be in. And I think a lot of people who haven't experienced that really don't ascribe that the value that it's owed.
Moral of the story, play more games.
Play games. That's it. I don't know how to better conclude than on that statement. So with that, we're going to bring episode 57 to a close. As always, we would love to hear from you, the audience. We imagine that so many of you have great stories of how did you push past the awkwardness of kind of admitting that you're a gamer and talking to your peers, your friends, your family about that.
I got a tattoo of Pac-Man on my forehead.
Oh, wow.
I got it fixed.
Wow. Okay. Good. Good.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a current tattoo of Pac-Man on your forehead, then we'll talk about that as well.
Awesome.
But we'd love to hear about also your stories of why did you stay in the hobby? We know if you're listening to this show that you did, but we just love to hear what was that point, what was that decision point that helped you say, I'm sticking this one out, and this one's a keeper. We'd love to hear from you, so hit us up at businesscasualgamers.com. Tweet at us at BISCasualGamers. Look for some more content coming up on YouTube on Business Casual Gamers. And with that, we will bring episode 57 to a close.
Thanks all.